You're going to find lots of different ways to figure out the meanings of tarot cards. The way that I focus on, and that I hope people will engage with at least a little bit, no matter what your preferred method of learning is to use the cards to interpret each other and to interpret themselves by thinking of them as visual documents. And your visual experience of these documents can be informed by history and what the designers were referring to and thinking about as they made these cards. But I call myself a tarologist because people who think through the visual nature of the cards and reflect on how it influences their life and their way of seeing are looking at the cards and thinking about life, thinking about meaning through the visual cues that they personally experience in life as compared with the cards. I'm going to give you an example of how this works with a card that gets a really bad rap these days. I've seen entire chapters of tarot books dedicated to how much the author dislikes the Pope. In some styles of deck, the Pope is reinterpreted as the Hierophant, though the imagery is generally pretty similar. Sometimes it is a modern take on what a spiritual advisor ought to look like in the artist's reference. But I use this classical deck for a lot of reasons, and rethinking what the Pope means to us in both its positive and negative connotations helps us to see the deck as a reference to the construction of society, how humans tend to deal with life, and it offers us a lot of lessons about how to deal with the problematic aspects of every card, as well as bringing the positive aspects of every card more into focus and putting that excellence into the way that we live life. You've got to have the difficult side in order to understand how to deal with it and how to transform that into something better. Though the Pope offers one of the greatest challenges to making things better because he represents bureaucracy, the way that community decisions unfold, which are almost never to any one person's exact preference because they're about negotiation. And one clue we get to that is that these guys on the bottom of the card, because if you look closely, these are two people wearing cloaks. They have monks' tonsors. So the fact that their heads are shaved that way means that they are members of the clergy. Their traveling clothes imply that they have come from somewhere else to have a conversation with the highest member of their organization. Now, the card is named the Pope. It comes from a time when the Pope was the primary religious figure in Europe and had contact with powerful Italian families, powerful members of courts, lords from around all of Europe, as well as the Holy Roman Empire. So there was a lot of power, a lot of authority, and a lot of corruption wrapped up in the figure of the Pope. The Pope is also a reinterpretation of the highest member of Rome's religious order. So in many ways, the position is a carryover from imperial religion, from doing rites that made the bureaucratic order secure, in the sense of ritual, in the sense of performing how the order was supposed to work to everybody who observed. Did it always work that way? Absolutely not. That's why it is viewed with such suspicion. However, the figure of the Pope as a representative of hierarchy and the idea that there are traditional ways to do things that go all the way from the top to people working on the ground in communities trying to make things work out. That sense of order does have a positive impact on us. Most of us don't want to live in scenarios of absolute chaos where every time we encounter another person, we don't know what they're going to do, and we don't have any way to clue them in on what we're going to do. Most of us like to have a little bit of ceremony, a veneer of politeness, so that when we encounter each other, when we need something from each other, we know how to interact so that we show, I'm not going to do you any harm through this process, but instead I'm behaving with the decorum that shows you what role I am taking and what you can expect from me in this situation. The Pope card wraps up all of those ideas. And we can think of this as, yes, a representative of potential corruption and all of the problematic communications and interactions that can happen in hierarchies. But the fact that the Pope is holding this three-layered staff is a reference to the idea that the real authority behind this figure comes from the human relationship with the divine. That we need the divine sense of the world, a respect for what it is, what it offers us, and where we come from. A respect for one another and our own agency in what we do, and the expectation that spiritually we are being held to things that in many ways equalize us. Regardless of what our role or position is, this symbol shows that our energy, our sense of what is good and real, has a stable sense that is outside of our own opinions. And we need community and organization and group interaction in order to come to an agreement about how those forces are working upon us and how we are going to enact them in our lives. And that's why the card is so difficult. Because people do this in different ways, in different time periods, in different places. They work out differently depending on where the people in the community are coming from, the resources they have available, and the circumstances that they're working with. So the whole process is messy. It's number 5. 5 is the number of fingers you've got on each hand. It's sort of the number of points that you have on your body. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. 5 is the most human numerologically. And humans make mistakes. Humans have individual foibles and failings. And the numerology of the card reflects that this process of coming together, developing hierarchies that work, that are flexible enough to change and allow for shifts of power that really represent the needs of the people who are operating within that power. It's messy, it's difficult, it requires a lot of deliberation, a lot of hand waving. And we see that reflected in the card. Now, this thinking through of the abstract sense and symbols that we have here in the card is a beginning to understanding what the card can mean in readings. So we have community, we have debate, we have negotiation over how we are going to work together and exactly what forces need to be respected as we come into groups for purposes. But then we should also look at the neighboring cards. Because if we think of this as a visual document, the cards are numbered, and so there is a sense of order that one card precedes and connects with the one before it, and then there's a sense of moving into the next card. So the card before the Pope is the Emperor. Another card that people often have a lot of conflict with personally. They don't want to think that there is this single overarching source of all power and authority in the world. And yet we often think of, or at least we struggle with our egos as the sense of authority that we tend to follow, that we think is right, that we want to have primacy over everything else. You notice that these two figures are looking away from each other. The Emperor is seated on this symbol of his rule, the eagle crest, whereas the Pope, you can't really see where he is seated. You only see that there are two pillars behind him that are almost going to the top of the card, though his staff goes higher. So we have this sense of spiritual foundation on earth, sacred places where people come together to make decisions reflecting spiritual will. Whereas for the Emperor, he is seated very clearly on the ground. He deals with earthly things, and the way that these guys don't look at each other, we see that the Emperor's concerns are not nearly as complicated as the Pope's concerns. The Emperor needs to enforce the stability of his rule and of the authority that he has in the world. He is not dealing as much with regular people on the ground. The fact that he is pictured in profile, which only a few characters in this deck are, shows that you don't have full access to the Emperor, either as a person or even in his role. The Emperor has got to divide himself among a lot of different interests, and in a lot of ways keep his person out of his role in order to do it properly. There is a great sense of dividing the role itself from the ego of the person. Whereas the Pope, you see his face, his full beard, and he is looking in the other direction with a sense of worry. Not nearly with this sense of distance and clarity that the Emperor has, but the Pope is concerned about what's coming next and how he needs to react to it. Again, because he is dealing with more complicated issues that shift faster, and he has more contact with every group of people who is involved with the authority that he holds. So then we look at the other side, the next card, the 6. In French is named the Lover because the focus is on this character in the middle. And it's almost as if these spiritual features, the pillars representing the right place of spiritual authority, the staff representing the sort of antenna to divine will, it's almost as if it has been replaced by Cupid in the sun, or blocking the sun. And Cupid with his arrow is aiming down at the people below. If you look at the hands in this image, it's sort of difficult to see what everybody's up to or what they want from each other. So what the Pope is looking at, what his concerns are about, are these kinds of social interactions, where the heart is involved, where he's not really sure what everybody's motivations are, and he wants everyone to feel protected, validated, underneath the divine will that he represents, but it's very difficult to figure out whose interests should be served, who should be primary, and exactly how to create traditions for the interactions that people want to have, the social bonds that they want to enforce, and ensure that those are going to go forward without disturbing society at large. So the Pope is dealing with moving targets. And that's even under ideal circumstances. In situations where the bureaucracy that the Pope represents is corrupt, where it moves very, very slow, where there are factors involved with it that don't represent what people in general want at all, but instead represent the interests of the few, then this connection becomes impossible to make. And the people on the ground who are engaging in new behaviors, exploring life, moving things forward in a social way that makes sense to them, they're going to have very little contact or trust for the Pope. Whatever this is abstractly representing in the real world, these people are going to try to have as little connection with it as possible because, as far as they're concerned, it represents traditions that have nothing to do with their feelings or with their personal bonds. There is one more card to consider when reflecting on each of these trumps, and that's the card that is 10 below or above it. So if this is the 5, the other card to look at is the 15. And there are a couple other numerical relationships that you can work on, but for right now, comparing each trump card to those 3 that are closest to it is going to give you a lot of information. So if we look at these 2 cards in visual comparison, each one has a central figure with 2 characters that are relating themselves to that figure in some way. And I think it's very important to recognize that in the process of getting from 1 to 5, as well as in the process of getting from 11 to 15, these are the first cards in those progressions that have more than one character on them. And that's one of the ways that we know that these cards are representing social interactions, community bonds, people working together. It's no longer just about one person. And I think that it's important to highlight that in a world where so much of the focus on the Pope card is about how much the individual dislikes the Pope, dislikes authority, wants to break out of tradition. Because what it's really referencing is how you deal with your own community, how you interact with them, how you engage with them, what traditions you and other group members that you associate with are relying on to make decisions, the things that you want to repeat in your life. And I don't think any of us wants to reject that entirely. I really love having dinner parties. I love getting together with people and cooking for them and eating with them. Without traditions that let everybody know what everybody else is doing and how to set that up in a pleasant way and establish expectations, none of us would have a good time. It'd be a mess. So I feel like I need that Pope energy in my life to enjoy the things that I like to do with others. It is vital to me in my communal life. So then, if the Pope represents authorized traditions, the way that things come down from a centralized sense of what to do, and people are interpreting it on the ground or being given an interpretation about how that tradition applies to their life, we see a different set of relationships here. This central figure, the devil character, could be an actual character, a living being, or looking at this podium could also be a statue. And the fact that these creatures, these animal people, are tied to the central podium, it reflects that there's a sense of being stuck here. If this is a statue, then these people have connected themselves to something that is a mixture of features that together don't usually appear in nature. It's male and female, it is human and animal, it mixes the features of a lot of different animals. You've got stag horns, bat's wings, claws like you might see on a cat. This isn't something that you would expect to encounter in the forest if you were traveling throughout Europe or really anywhere else. So if we're thinking about the Pope as a sense of general traditions that a community can follow, this seems to have more to do with traditions between individuals, getting into mischief, conspiring, breaking out of authority, and mixing parts that don't normally go together as far as communal behavior and social interaction, in order to feel like you have a place outside of the normal tradition, that you are exercising your individuality to such an extent that you are barely human. This can be positive in the framework of very close friendships. I think a lot about siblings who have private jokes that nobody else could understand. There's a lot of fun and pleasure in these isolated, private moments of joy that can be repeated. And the ability that we have to use our private sense of fun to dispel a lot of the tension and stress that comes out of following traditions consistently, feeling like we have to behave ourselves, that we're always following the rules. It's necessary for us to get outside of that tension from time to time, to make fun of the way that things normally operate and goof off some. Feel like we are free to go beyond the bounds of what this card implies. So we see a powerful interplay between these two conditions that are represented by the cards. And when they come up in readings, yes, it may be that somebody is dealing with religious trauma or feeling trapped within a tradition that isn't serving them, or a bureaucracy that is just running them around and wasting their time and energy. But it can also refer to the positive parts of tradition, where we all know what to do, we are happy to do it together because we see how it is bringing us into a kind of concert and allowing us to contribute our energy to something that is bigger than any of us could be individually. We all need that. And similarly, with the Devil card, there is a positive sense of just being able to enjoy yourself and cut loose, but then there is also this matter of having to cut loose so much that you fall prey to addiction, being connected with somebody who always brings you to a good time, but is taking you away from any sense of structure in your life. I very much hope that looking through this has been helpful to you. I'm working on a book of tarot meditations that are poetic evocations of the ideas that come out of each card so that you can place yourself into the situation of the card and reflect on exactly what it means to you and features of your life that relate you to that card's energy. Until then, or even as a supplement to that book, I hope that this method has been helpful to you, and I hope that in the comments you'll give me some ideas of what your explorations and comparisons of these cards in order and their relationships have meant to you. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day.